Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to join me today. The latest confrontation between Iran and the European Union did not begin with missiles, troop movements, or naval incidents. It began with a legal label. When the EU moved to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, it crossed a line that Tehran had long warned against the transformation of political hostility into juridical criminalization. Iran's response, delivered at the highest level by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, was deliberately symmetrical. By declaring EU military forces a terrorist organization, Tehran was not announcing an imminent military campaign. It was issuing a conceptual counterstrike. The message was simple but profound. If terrorism is no longer a universally defined category but a tool wielded by power blocs, then it can be turned back against its authors. This is a critical shift. For decades, the West has relied on the moral and legal weight of the term terrorism to isolate adversaries, justify sanctions, and legitimize coercive pressure. Iran's declaration challenges that monopoly. It exposes the fragility of an international system in which legal designations increasingly reflect alliance politics rather than objective standards. Tehran's language also reframes the conflict. The issue is no longer Iran versus Europe in a conventional sense, but sovereignty versus external classification, by warning European states not to interfere in Iran's internal affairs or participate in U.S. and Israeli-led pressure campaigns. Iran signals that regime stability, not territorial defense, is its primary red line. In this sense, the confrontation is not yet military, but it is deeply strategic. Words are being weaponized in preparation for future escalation. The danger lies not in what has been said, but in what these declarations make possible. Iran's declaration that EU military forces constitute a terrorist organization should not be read as a prelude to immediate kinetic action. It is instead a calculated exercise in deterrence through legal symmetry, a method Tehran has refined under decades of sanctions isolation and asymmetric pressure. By mirroring Europe's designation of the IRGC, Iran seeks to impose costs without crossing thresholds that would justify direct retaliation. The power of the move lies in its deliberate ambiguity. Tehran did not specify targets, timelines, or theaters of action. This vagueness is not a weakness, it is the strategy. Ambiguity expands the deterrent effect while minimizing Iran's exposure. European governments are left to infer risk across multiple domains: diplomatic intelligence, cyber, maritime, and regional proxy theaters, without a single trigger that would unify their response. Crucially, Iran's red lines are political, not territorial. The warning to European states is explicit: do not interfere in Iran's internal affairs, do not facilitate destabilization, and do not align operationally with the United States or Israel in actions that threaten regime continuity. From Tehran's perspective, the most dangerous threats are not airstrikes, but pressure architecture, sanctions regimes, covert support for unrest, information, warfare, and legal delegitimization that prepares the ground for regime change. Iran's leadership understands its relative position. It does not seek military parity with NATO, nor does it aim to challenge Europe conventionally. Instead, it aims to raise Europe's cost-benefit calculation. Any deeper European involvement now carries the prospect, however undefined, of retaliation that Europe is structurally ill-prepared to manage. Energy vulnerabilities, domestic political fragility, and public intolerance for escalation are all factored into Tehran's calculus. This is why Iran frames Europe as a potential participant rather than a primary adversary. The real axis of confrontation remains Tehran versus Washington and Tel Aviv. Europe is being warned against becoming an active enabler. Should it cross that line, Iran signals that European assets, political, economic, or regional, may lose their assumed immunity. In short, Iran is not threatening war, it is threatening uncertainty. And in strategic terms, uncertainty is often the more effective weapon, especially against actors whose power depends on predictability, legal order, and risk aversion. To understand whether European states are genuinely intimidated by Iran's warnings, one must look beyond rhetoric and assess Europe's structural position. The issue is not fear in the emotional sense, but constraint in the strategic sense. Europe today possesses economic weight and normative language, yet lacks the integrated power required to sustain a direct confrontation with a regional actor like Iran. The European Union is not a unified strategic actor. It is a political, economic bloc with fragmented threat perceptions, divergent national interests, and no independent military command capable of operating outside the U.S.-led security architecture. Even after years of discussion about strategic autonomy, Europe's hard power remains embedded in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where ultimate escalation authority rests in Washington, not Brussels. This matters deeply in the Iranian context. Any serious confrontation with Tehran would immediately raise questions Europe is unwilling to answer: who commands, who escalates, who absorbs retaliation, and most importantly, who pays the price domestically. European governments are acutely sensitive to instability. Energy markets, shipping routes, migration flows, and internal security are all potential pressure points that Iran can exploit directly or indirectly. Iran's threats are calibrated precisely to these vulnerabilities. Tehran does not need to strike European territory to influence European behavior. The mere possibility of disruption, whether through regional escalation, proxy dynamics, or heightened security risk, is sufficient to generate political hesitation in European capitals. Public opinion across Europe is largely hostile to new conflicts, particularly those perceived as extensions of U.S. or Israeli strategy rather than European necessity. Moreover, Europe's credibility problem is self-inflicted. By selectively applying legal and moral categories, branding adversaries as terrorists, while tolerating allies' excesses, the EU weakens the authority of its own designations. Iran understands this inconsistency and exploits it to portray Europe not as a neutral actor, but as a subcontractor of American policy. Thus, Europe's response to Iran's declaration will likely remain cautious. There may be condemnations, reaffirmations of values, and symbolic measures, but not a readiness for escalation. This is not a moral weakness. It reflects structural dependence. Europe can afford confrontation only when the United States carries the strategic burden. In this light, Iran's warnings are effective not because Europe is terrified, but because Europe is constrained militarily, politically, and psychologically from testing them. Despite the sharp rhetoric exchanged between Tehran and Brussels, the likelihood of the European Union openly confronting Iran remains extremely low. Europe's behavior in past crises reveals a consistent pattern in moral positioning without strategic exposure. The current standoff is unlikely to break that pattern. Publicly, European officials will continue to defend the designation of the IRGC frame Iran as a destabilizing actor and emphasize commitment to international norms. Privately, however, European capitals understand the limits of their leverage. A direct confrontation with Iran, military, covert, or even overtly strategic, would expose Europe's dependence on external actors, most notably the United States, for control of escalation, intelligence dominance, and force projection. This is precisely what Europe seeks to avoid. Any direct EU-Iran clash would immediately transform into a broader US-Iran confrontation, pulling Europe into a conflict it neither commands nor controls. For European policymakers, this is the worst possible outcome, maximum risk with minimal agency. Instead, Europe will default to indirect confrontation. This includes legal measures, sanctions enforcement, diplomatic isolation, and rhetorical alignment with Washington and Israel without assuming operational responsibility. The EU will attempt to remain visible enough to satisfy alliance expectations while remaining distant enough to preserve plausible deniability. Iran understands this dynamic well. Tehran's threats are therefore not designed to provoke an immediate European response, but to discipline European behavior over time by raising the specter of retaliation, undefined but persistent. Iran encourages restraint in areas that matter most to it: internal destabilization, intelligence, cooperation, and participation in escalation scenarios crafted outside in Europe. There is also a political reality inside Europe that constrains action. European publics are fatigued by conflict, skeptical of foreign interventions, and increasingly focused on domestic economic pressures. Any move toward open confrontation with Iran would be politically costly, difficult to justify, and vulnerable to backlash, especially if framed as serving American or Israeli priorities rather than European security. As a result, Europe's most probable course is rhetorical firmness paired with strategic caution. It will condemn Iran loudly but act narrowly. It will align symbolically but hesitate operationally. This duality is not accidental. It is the product of a system that seeks influence without responsibility. From Tehran's perspective, this confirms the effectiveness of its approach. Iran does not need Europe to retreat entirely, only to hesitate. In a confrontation defined by red lines and ambiguity, hesitation itself becomes a strategic victory. The confrontation between Iran and the European Union reveals something far more consequential than a bilateral dispute. It exposes the structural erosion of the international legal order, where shared definitions are collapsing and power increasingly substitutes for principle. When major actors begin labeling each other's armed forces as terrorist organizations, the language of global governance loses coherence. For decades, the concept of terrorism was anchored, at least nominally, in multilateral frameworks associated with institutions like the United Nations. While always imperfect, these frameworks relied on a minimum consensus. Terrorism referred to non-state violence against civilians, not the standing militaries of sovereign states. That boundary is now being dismantled. Europe's decision to designate the IRGC reflects a broader Western trend, the instrumentalization of legal language to advance strategic objectives. Iran's response, in turn, demonstrates that such tools are no longer monopolized by the West. What emerges is a system of reciprocal criminalization, where legality is no longer universal, but bloc-dependent. Law becomes an extension of alignment. This is a dangerous transformation. Once legal designations lose their neutral character, they cease to restrain conflict and instead prepare it. The mutual branding of terrorist does not clarify norms, it dissolves them. In such an environment, escalation no longer requires provocation, only interpretation. Any action, real or alleged, can be reframed as justification. Europe, in particular, is ill-positioned for this shift. Its influence has long rested on rules, institutions, and moral authority rather than coercive power. By participating in selective legal warfare, the EU undermines the very foundations of its global role. Iran, despite its economic vulnerabilities, understands this asymmetry and exploits it effectively. The likely outcome is not immediate war, but chronic instability. Diplomatic space shrinks, crisis management becomes harder, miscalculation becomes more probable. When words themselves become weapons, restraint is no longer embedded in language. It must be consciously imposed by leaders under pressure. In this sense, Iran's threats and Europe's designations are symptoms, not causes. They reflect a world moving away from shared rules toward fragmented power spheres. The tragedy is that no actor truly benefits from this shift. Yet without a return to consistent multilateral standards, the cycle will continue. This episode is therefore not a prelude to missiles, but to something quieter and more corrosive, the normalization of legal hostility as a substitute for diplomacy. And once normalized, it becomes exceedingly difficult to reverse. Thank you for watching.